It was supposed to be a regular Friday night at work. I'd been pulling long shifts as a server at one of the city's most prestigious private clubs, a place where wealthy patrons wined, dined, and threw extravagant parties without blinking at the obscene costs. For most of them, the waitstaff like me were invisible. Just another part of the scenery, another layer of luxury they expected to cater to their whims. But on this particular night, everything changed. The night started like any other. The club had been rented out for a private gathering hosted by an infamous billionaire named Victor Hensley. Everyone in the service industry knew his name. Hensley wasn't just rich, he was obnoxiously, obscenely, loudly rich, and he never let anyone forget it. He wasn't shy about his disdain for people he considered beneath him, which meant people like me were nothing more than disposable furniture in his world. I was in the corner of the grand ballroom, refilling champagne glasses from a silver tray. The room was packed with guests in designer gowns and tailored suits, their laughter and chatter bouncing off the high ceilings. A grand piano stood in the center of the room, gleaming under the chandelier's light, though it remained untouched. I tried to keep my head down and stay out of sight, but Hensley had a way of making himself impossible to ignore. "Who's that over there?" His booming voice carried across the room and I froze mid-pour. He was pointing directly at me. The crowd turned to look, their gazes heavy and judgmental. I could feel the blood rushing to my cheeks as I quickly set the champagne bottle back on my tray, trying to make myself smaller. "You," he called out again, grinning like a man who'd just spotted an opportunity to amuse himself. "Come here." I hesitated for a split second before forcing my legs to move. It wasn't like I had a choice. Refusing a man like Victor Hensley wasn't an option if you wanted to keep your job. "Yes, sir," I said as politely as I could, keeping my voice steady despite the nerves twisting in my stomach. He looked me up and down, his smirk widening. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Sophie," I said quietly. "Well, Sophie," he said, leaning back in his chair like he owned the entire world, "you're going to help me entertain my guests tonight." My heart sank. I had no idea what he was planning, but the gleam in his eyes told me it wasn't going to be good. He gestured toward the grand piano. "Do you play?" The question caught me off guard. I used to," I admitted cautiously. That was an understatement. I'd been playing piano since I was a kid, spending hours practicing on the old upright in my parents' living room. Music had been my passion once, my escape from the world. But after my family fell on hard times and I had to drop out of college to help pay the bills, playing became a luxury I couldn't afford. These days I barely touched a piano. "Perfect," Hensley said, clapping his hands together. "Let's see what you've got." "I really don't think," I started to protest, but he cut me off with a wave of his hand. "Don't be shy," he said loudly, his voice dripping with condescension. "I'm sure you're just dying to show off in front of a crowd like this." Laughter rippled through the room. I glanced around, seeing nothing but amused smirks and curious stares. My throat tightened. "I'm not." "Do it," he interrupted, his tone sharp now. "Or should I have a word with your manager?" That was all it took. The threat hung in the air and I knew I didn't have a choice. Reluctantly, I nodded and made my way toward the piano, my hands trembling. The room fell silent as I sat down on the bench. My reflection stared back at me from the piano's polished surface, and for a moment I felt frozen. Every eye in the room was on me, waiting for me to embarrass myself. Hensley's voice broke the silence. "Let's hope you're better at this than serving drinks," he said, earning another round of laughter from his guests. I swallowed hard, pressing my fingers to the keys. They felt foreign under my touch, like I'd forgotten what to do. But then as I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, something shifted. The room disappeared. The laughter, the judgment, the weight of Hensley's smug gaze. All of it faded away. And then I played. The first notes came hesitantly, my fingers stiff from years without practice. But as the melody began to take shape, something deep within me stirred. It was like my body remembered what my mind had forgotten. Muscle memory took over, guiding my hands across the keys with growing confidence. I chose a piece I'd loved as a teenager, a hauntingly beautiful composition by Debussy. The opening notes were soft and tentative, but soon the music swelled, filling the room with rich, flowing chords and cascading arpeggios. By the time I reached the middle of the piece, I was no longer thinking about the crowd or Victor Hensley's smug smirk. The music wrapped itself around me, lifting me out of the room entirely. For the first time in years I felt alive. When the final note faded into silence, I opened my eyes to find the entire room staring at me. For a moment no one moved or spoke. The air was thick with shock. And then slowly someone began to clap. It started with one person, then another, until the entire room erupted into applause. People were standing now, their faces filled with a mixture of awe and disbelief. Hensley, however, didn't look pleased. His confident smirk had been replaced by something else. Something closer to irritation. "Well," he said loudly, forcing a laugh, "I didn't expect that. Not bad for a waitress." The applause faltered as the room turned to him, unsure whether to follow his lead. He waved dismissively, signaling for everyone to sit down. The energy in the room shifted and the moment was over. As I stood to leave the piano, a middle-aged woman in an expensive gown approached me. Her face was kind, her smile genuine. "That was extraordinary," she said, her voice warm. "Do you play professionally?" I shook my head, suddenly self-conscious. "No, not anymore." "Well, you should," she said firmly. "You have a gift." "Thank you," I murmured, my cheeks burning. Other guests began to approach me as well, offering compliments and questions about my musical background. I answered as politely as I could, but the attention was overwhelming. All I wanted was to escape back into the kitchen where I could be invisible again. Before I could leave, Hensley called out to me. "Sophie." A word. I turned to see him standing by the bar, a drink in hand. His expression was unreadable, but there was a sharpness in his eyes that made my stomach twist. I walked over cautiously, stopping a few feet away. "Yes, sir." He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, studying me. "I have to admit, that was impressive. You've got talent. Real talent." "Thank you," I said, unsure where this was going. "But don't let it go to your head," he added, his tone turning cold. "This is a party, not a concert hall. You work here to serve, not to show off." His words stung, but I forced myself to keep my face neutral. "I understand." "Good," he said, finishing his drink in one gulp. "Now get back to work." I returned to the kitchen, my hands still trembling, not from fear but from adrenaline. The other servers gave me curious glances, clearly having heard what happened, but no one said anything. As I refilled trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres, my mind raced. For a brief moment I'd been seen, really seen. Not as a waitress but as someone with something to offer, something to say. But Hensley's words echoed in my head, pulling me back down to reality. I wasn't a musician. I was a server, and I couldn't afford to let anyone, least of all him, think otherwise. Later that night, as I was cleaning up after the party, the woman in the gown approached me again. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said, her kind smile returning. "But I couldn't leave without speaking to you again." "It's fine," I said, setting down the tray I'd been holding. "How can I help you?" She held out a business card, the name Margaret Lawson printed in elegant script. "I'm the director of the city's symphony orchestra," she said. "We've been looking for new talent for an upcoming series. If you're interested, I'd love to set up an audition." My breath caught. I don't know what to say." "Say yes," she said with a laugh. "You have something special, Sophie. Don't let it go to waste." After she left, I stood there staring at the card for what felt like forever. It was an opportunity I'd never expected, one that could change everything. But then I thought about Hensley, about his condescending words and the power he held over my job. If I pursued this, would it come back to haunt me? I slipped the card into my pocket, unsure what to do. For the first time in years, I had a glimmer of hope. But hope could be dangerous, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to take that risk. After Margaret Lawson handed me her card, I felt like I was carrying more than just a thin piece of cardstock in my pocket. It felt like I was holding a crossroads, a potential shift in my life that could either change everything or go nowhere at all. For the rest of the night, I couldn't stop thinking about her words. "You have something special. Don't let it go to waste." But Margaret didn't know me. She didn't know about the bills I was barely keeping up with, the 2 jobs I was juggling just to stay afloat, or the endless weight of responsibility that left no room for dreams. She didn't know that the last time I'd thought about playing piano seriously, my life had already been on the verge of falling apart. As I finished cleaning up after the party and headed home, her card burned a hole in my pocket, a silent reminder that there was a choice to be made. By the time I got back to my tiny apartment, it was almost 3 a.m. The space was dark and cramped, with mismatched furniture I'd picked up from thrift stores over the years. It wasn't much, but it was mine. a reminder of the independence I'd fought so hard to keep after my family's financial collapse. I sat at the small kitchen table, pulling the card out of my pocket and placing it in front of me. The name Margaret Lawson gleamed under the dim light of the overhead lamp, along with the words, Director, City Symphony Orchestra. Beneath that was her phone number and email address, neatly printed in elegant script. I stared at it for a long time, my mind a whirlwind of thoughts. Could I really do it? Could I audition for a symphony after so many years away from music? What if I embarrassed myself? What if I wasn't good enough? But another thought lingered at the back of my mind, one I couldn't shake. What if I didn't try? What if I spent the rest of my life stuck in this endless cycle of dead-end jobs, always wondering what might have been? I didn't know the answer, but the uncertainty kept me awake for the rest of the night. The next morning, I found myself in front of the old upright piano in my apartment. It had been a gift from my parents when I was 12, back when they still believed I'd be a professional musician someday. It was battered now, the wood scratched and faded, but the keys still worked. Mostly. I sat down and placed my hands on the keys, hesitating for a moment before pressing down. The first notes came out uneven, the piano slightly out of tune, but as I played, the familiar feeling began to return. My fingers stumbled at first, but the muscle memory was still there, buried beneath years of neglect. For the next 2 hours I practiced. I pulled out old sheet music I hadn't touched in years, my fingers fumbling over the notes until they began to flow again. It was frustrating at times, reminders of how much I'd lost, how far I was from the pianist I used to be, but there were also moments of joy, flashes of the connection I'd once felt to the music. By the time I finally stopped, my hands were trembling and my shoulders ached. But for the first time in years I felt alive. Over the next week I practiced whenever I could. My shifts at the club were exhausting, but I found myself counting down the hours until I could go home and sit at the piano. I worked through old pieces I hadn't played in years, forcing my fingers to remember the movements and rhythms that had once been second nature. But as much as I tried to focus on the music, I couldn't stop thinking about Victor Hensley. Every time I walked into the club, I wondered if he'd be there, waiting to humiliate me again. His words still echoed in my mind. This is a party, not a concert hall. You work here to serve, not to show off. I hated how much power he had over me, how his condescension made me doubt myself even as I fought to rebuild my confidence. But I also knew that his cruelty had inadvertently reignited something I thought I'd lost forever. On a quiet Wednesday evening, as I was wiping down tables after a slow night at the club, Margaret Lawson walked through the door. She spotted me immediately, her face lighting up with recognition. "Sophie," she called out, making her way over. I froze, unsure how to react. "Ms. Lawson," I said, forcing a polite smile. "What brings you here?" "I was in the area and thought I'd stop by," she said, her tone cheerful. "I wanted to see if you'd thought about my offer." I hesitated, glancing around the empty dining room. I've been practicing," I admitted. Her smile widened. "That's wonderful to hear. So will you audition?" I hesitated again, my stomach twisting with nerves. "I'm not sure if I'm ready," I said. "It's been so long since I've played seriously and I don't know if I'm good enough anymore." Margaret's expression softened. "Sophie, talent like yours doesn't just disappear. It might take some time to rebuild your confidence, but I promise you, you're capable of so much more than you realize." Her words hit me harder than I expected, and for a moment I didn't know what to say. "I'll think about it," I said finally. She nodded, reaching into her bag and pulling out a flyer. "We're holding auditions in 2 weeks," she said, handing it to me. "If you change your mind, we'd love to see you there." That night I sat at my piano staring at the flyer. The audition was for a series of performances featuring up-and-coming musicians. An opportunity one never would have dreamed of a month ago. But with opportunity came fear. What if I failed? What if I embarrassed myself in front of an audience again? And yet I couldn't stop thinking about Margaret's words. "You're capable of so much more than you realize." For the first time in years I allowed myself to hope. The day of the audition came faster than I expected. I arrived at the concert hall early, clutching my sheet music and trying to steady my breathing. The other musicians in the waiting area looked confident and polished, their instruments gleaming under the bright lights. I felt completely out of place. When my name was finally called, I walked onto the stage, my hands trembling as I sat down at the grand piano. The judges watched me with polite but neutral expressions, their pens poised over their clipboards. For a moment I froze. The weight of the moment felt crushing and I wondered if I'd made a terrible mistake. But then I remembered why I was there. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath and began to play. The moment my fingers touched the keys, the weight of the audition room melted away. I played the opening notes slowly, carefully, letting the melody flow as if it were breathing on its own. The grand piano sound was richer than anything I'd ever played before, and it felt like the instrument was pulling the best out of me. The piece I chose wasn't flashy, it was emotional. It wasn't designed to impress with technical brilliance but to move the listener. I wanted to play something that told a story, something that reminded me why I had fallen in love with music in the first place. Halfway through, I dared to glance at the judges. Their faces were still neutral, their pens poised, but there was something different in the way they were watching me. They weren't just evaluating anymore, they were listening. That realization gave me a boost of confidence. My hands moved with more certainty, the notes coming alive under my fingers. I poured everything I had into the music, every frustration, every doubt, every ounce of hope I'd felt in the past few weeks. By the time I played the final chord, my hands were trembling, but not from fear. I sat there for a moment, letting the sound linger before slowly lifting my fingers from the keys. The room was silent. For a few agonizing seconds, the judges didn't say anything. I felt my stomach twist as I imagined all the things they might be thinking. That I wasn't good enough, that I didn't belong here, that I'd wasted their time. And then one of them, a tall man with silver hair and a sharp suit, leaned forward and said, "That was extraordinary." His voice was calm but sincere and the tension in my chest eased slightly. Another judge, a younger woman with glasses, nodded. "You have a raw, emotional quality to your playing," she said. "It's refreshing. You made us feel the music, not just hear it." Their words washed over me, leaving me both stunned and relieved. "Thank you," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. When I left the stage, my heart was still racing. I had no idea if I'd done well enough to secure a spot in the series, but I felt something I hadn't in years: pride. For the first time in what felt like forever, I'd taken a risk and it hadn't destroyed me. Margaret Lawson was waiting for me in the hallway, her smile wide and genuine. "I knew you'd be incredible," she said. I shook my head, laughing nervously. "I don't know about incredible." "No, Sophie," she said firmly. "That was special. You have something that can't be taught." Her words filled me with a warmth I couldn't quite describe. "Thank you," I said, and this time I meant it. A week later I got the email. I was sitting at my kitchen table after a long shift at the club, scrolling through my phone when I saw it in my inbox. City Symphony Orchestra audition results. My hands were shaking as I opened it, my eyes scanning the text for the words that mattered most. And there it was. "Congratulations, Sophie Blake. You have been selected to perform in the New Voices series." I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. I had done it. The first rehearsal was scheduled for the following Monday, and I walked into the concert hall feeling a mixture of excitement and nerves. The other musicians were all incredibly talented, and I couldn't help but feel out of place among them. But when I sat down at the piano and began to play, all of that faded away. The music took over, and for the first time in years I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. Word of my audition must have spread, because when I went back to work at the club, I noticed that the other staff members were treating me differently. There were whispers as I walked by, curious glances, and even a few tentative congratulations from the servers I worked with. But not everyone was pleased. Victor Hensley was back. I was clearing tables in the lounge when he called me over, his voice as sharp as ever. "Sophie," he said, his tone dripping with false politeness. "I hear you've been busy lately." I stopped in front of him, forcing myself to remain calm. "I've been practicing," I said simply. "Practicing," he repeated, leaning back in his chair. "Is that what we're calling it now? I heard you auditioned for the symphony. How ambitious of you." His words were laced with sarcasm, but I didn't take the bait. "I'm excited about the opportunity," I said. He raised an eyebrow, smirking. "Let me give you a piece of advice, Sophie. Don't get ahead of yourself. A little talent is nice, but it doesn't mean you belong in a world like that. You'd do well to remember your place." The comment stung, but I refused to let him see it. I met his gaze head-on and said, "Thank you for your advice, Mr. Hensley. I'll keep that in mind." His smirk faltered and I turned away before he could respond. That night, as I sat at my piano, I thought about everything that had happened since Hensley forced me to play at his party. He had humiliated me, tried to make me feel small, but in doing so he had reignited a spark I thought was long gone. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to let people like Victor Hensley dictate my worth. The weeks leading up to the New Voices performance were some of the most surreal of my life. Rehearsals at the Symphony Hall became my sanctuary. The other musicians welcomed me as one of their own, their camaraderie and talent inspiring me to push harder, to refine my playing and to believe, truly believe, that I belonged there. Each day at the club felt more and more disconnected from the life I was starting to rebuild. The sound of silverware clinking on fine china, the constant drone of guests barking orders, it all seemed so small compared to the world of music I had stepped back into. Victor Hensley continued to hover on the periphery, watching me with that smug, condescending smirk whenever he showed up at the club. But he didn't say much after our last encounter. Maybe he thought I'd burn out or fail. Maybe he thought I wasn't worth his time anymore. Either way, I didn't care. I was focused on the music. The night of the performance arrived faster than I expected. The concert hall was packed, the audience buzzing with anticipation. My nerves were a wreck, but as I sat backstage waiting for my turn, I thought about everything that had led me here. The years of sacrifice, the nights spent practicing on my battered old piano, the way my heart had leapt when Margaret handed me that card. And yes, even Hensley's humiliating demand at his party, how it had pushed me to rediscover something I thought I'd lost forever. When the stage manager called my name, I took a deep breath, smoothed down my dress and walked out into the bright lights of the stage. The applause was polite but subdued, the audience waiting to see what this unknown performer had to offer. I sat down at the grand piano, my hands trembling slightly as I placed them on the keys. And then I began to play. The piece I chose was a personal one, a composition I had written during a time of deep uncertainty in my life. It started softly, the notes flowing like a stream, delicate and introspective. But as the music built, it transformed into something bolder, more defiant. A declaration of resilience, of finding strength in the face of doubt. The piano seemed to sing under my hands, each note resonating through the hall like a heartbeat. By the time I reached the final chords, the audience was silent. I let the sound linger for a moment before lifting my hands from the keys, the weight of the performance settling over me. For a heartbeat, there was nothing but silence. And then the applause began. It started slowly, tentatively, but it quickly grew into a thunderous ovation. People were standing, their faces lit with admiration, and for the first time in years I felt truly seen. After the performance, Margaret found me backstage, her smile radiant. "You were extraordinary, Sophie," she said, pulling me into a warm hug. "The audience loved you. Did you hear that applause?" "I still can't believe it," I said, laughing nervously. "Well, believe it," she said. "This is just the beginning for you. Opportunities like this don't come around often, but you've proven you're ready for them." Her words filled me with a warmth I hadn't felt in years. For so long I doubted myself, convinced that my dreams were out of reach. But now, standing there with Margaret's encouragement ringing in my ears, I felt like anything was possible. Back at the club the following week, something shifted. The staff treated me with a newfound respect, and even some of the regular patrons who had attended the performance stopped to congratulate me. Hensley, however, remained silent. He came in one evening, sitting at his usual spot in the lounge, and watched me with narrowed eyes as I carried trays back and forth. As I walked past him, he finally spoke. "Not bad," he said, swirling his drink. "But don't let it get to your head. It's a long way from one performance to success." I stopped and turned to face him, meeting his gaze with quiet confidence. "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Hensley," I said calmly. "But I think I'll manage just fine." His smirk faltered, and for the first time he seemed at a loss for words. I walked away, a small smile playing on my lips. In the months that followed, my life began to change. The New Voices performance opened doors I never thought possible. Small gigs, private recitals, even an offer to collaborate on a recording project. I still worked at the club for a while, but it became less about necessity and more about transition. By the time I handed in my notice, I wasn't the same person who had nervously stood at that piano during Hensley's party. I was someone who had found her voice again. Looking back, I realized that sometimes the most unexpected moments of humiliation, of doubt, of being pushed beyond what feels comfortable, are the ones that force us to grow. Victor Hensley had tried to embarrass me, to make me feel small. but instead he'd unknowingly set me on a path toward rediscovering the part of myself I thought I'd lost forever. As I sat at my piano in my tiny apartment, practicing for my next recital, I felt a sense of peace. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had brought me back to the music. And for that I was grateful.